This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Hapern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Hapern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind, with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who've done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University, whose most recent research focuses on Europe's encounter with its Muslim immigrants and the Jewish background to that complex relationship in the midst of which we currently stand. Professor Amikam Nachmani, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, good morning.
So what you argue, if I understand it correctly, is that the relationship between Europe and the Muslim immigration is not a bilateral relationship, but rather a love triangle, as it were, in inverted commas, with the legacy of the Jewish presence in Europe being the third pole. How so?
Correct. I realized for the last, I believe, more than 10 years, I deal with the issue of Muslim immigration into Europe. This led me already to produce a book that was published in about 5 years ago in England about Europe and its Muslim minorities. And now another one is going to be published by Manchester University Press, probably the end of this year, on the issue of, I titled it Haunted Presence, Europeans, Muslims, and the onus of European Jewish histories. This is rather, I would say, very humbly, and I try to remain as modest as possible. This is something that nobody has yet dealt with. That is to say, the Jewish background, and not only background, but contemporary affairs, Jewish contemporary affairs that affect the encounter between Europeans and the Muslims.
Mm-hmm. And what are the modalities of this influence?
Well, perhaps I'll tell you an anecdote that caused me to deal with it. And because at the beginning I thought that this is only an anecdote, nothing to push somebody to spend time on it. I spent some time with some Turkish Muslim immigrants in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And after being together with them, by the way, the Turkish representatives there, or the representatives of the Turkish associations in Berlin are extremely articulate. They present their case in probably the best possible way to present the case of an immigrant in a foreign country. Anyhow, after 3 days that I interviewed them, and they were very patient with me and very tolerant with me, etc., I asked so-called a naive question, quote unquote. Tell me, please, why the majority of you, or the average immigrant, at least in Germany, doesn't know the German language, does not integrate as people would like him to integrate, does not leave the culture of the country, does not experience, let's say, even the civilization of the country.
Do not fully assimilate, you say.
Well, or at least integrate, if not to fully assimilate, or at least integrate. Well, they started to laugh. They held their bellies, they couldn't stop laughing, and I was a bit embarrassed, and I said, what was so wrong in the question? What was illegitimate in the question? What's so illegal in this question? And then they asked me, tell me, first of all, they said that they expected a more intelligent question from me, A. Mm-hmm. And B, they said, listen, have you ever come across a group of people who were more German than German Jews? And did it help them? So why bother? Well, I thought that this is some kind of an anecdote, not more than this, probably even a manipulation, not more than this. But when I left them, I continued to think about it. A. B was another occasion in a conference, in an academic conference that dealt with the issue of Muslim immigration into Europe. And then somebody said, and excuse me for talking about myself in a third person, and they said, you know why there are so many Muslims in Europe? This is because of Mr. Nachmani's forefathers and grandparents, etc., etc. And I was amazed, and I didn't know.
Where was he from?
He was a European, anyhow. He was a European, and they said, you know why there are so many Muslims in Europe? This is because of the Jews. And the Jews were, at that very moment, the forefathers of Mr. Nachmani. And I said, why am I to be blamed about it?
Yeah.
And the reply...
Or credited.
Or credited. And the reply was very surprising. That is to say, because Europeans exterminated the Jews in World War II, so now they are obliged and are committed to treat any foreigner who comes to Europe in a politically correct manner, to enable them to come to Europe, to enable them to stay in the continent, and in any case not to refer and to relate to them in the way Europeans treated Jews in World War II.
But this is less and less the case, isn't it? Because with the rise of the far right in Europe and intolerance towards immigration.
So probably the rise of the radical right in Europe was probably a reaction concerning the tolerance or the political correctness that was, I would say, applied towards immigrants who came to Europe during the last 2 generations or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, by the way, as a general rule, that the current immigration, the Muslim immigration in Europe, is markedly different from previous waves of immigration and the problems that come along with it?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because in general, when you take immigrants who come to a certain country, for instance, take the US, people come to the United States to be Americans. It doesn't imply that they do not keep their ethnicity and culture. I mean, you can talk about American Jews, about Chinese Americans, about Irish Americans, Italian Americans, etc., etc. But people come to the US to become Americans. You see in Europe concerning Muslim immigration that for the moment, you're not sure that they came to Europe to become Europeans.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the problem is in Europe rather than in the immigrants.
Could be.
I mean, because if it's the same group of immigrants going to different places, in one country they assimilate or integrate, in the other it's more difficult. Maybe the setting.
If I may add something here, I think that if somebody looks at this equation, Europeans versus Muslims or the other way around, I'm not sure that so-called the problem or the issue is to be found only in Muslims or only in Europeans. What I want to say, I've just written an article in the Haaretz newspaper about it. Europe, unfortunately, does not have a very good credit concerning treating minorities and treating the other and his otherness.
Mm-hmm. To this day?
To this day. But perhaps let me start with another aspect or probably another issue. When you talk to Israelis and when you talk to the average Israeli concerning the issue of Muslim immigration into Europe today, you get 3 main replies. A, well, Europeans deserve it. B, at long last, they will experience and feel what we feel, okay? And the third one was, let them eat what they cooked, or something like this. Yeah. The common denominator of these 3 replies is that we are outsiders, we Israelis are outsiders, and we are not involved. And, we look and we watch this encounter, not very peaceful encounter between Europeans and Muslims, and we say, as outsiders and people who are not involved, enjoy the encounter or whatever, or etc., etc. And this is wrong, absolutely wrong. We are terribly involved. We are heavily involved. Jews and Israelis, we are heavily involved in the encounter.
Is it because of the shadow of the Holocaust, or is it more than that?
No, perhaps I can tell you an example that happened about a few years ago when I was in Berlin again, and we heard one of the representatives or one of the people who contested or competed at that very time to become the mayor of Berlin. He was a brilliant...
the Palestinian.
He was a brilliant Palestinian, extremely articulate. And somebody else, again, of Muslim origin at that very time, later on told me like this: listen, I owe you nothing. Me, living here in Germany, unlike the German society or the German people who are living here, I myself owe you nothing. My grandfather did not kill your grandfather. If there was any encounter, hostile encounter between them, it is probably that your grandfather killed my grandfather. Okay. Anyhow, I'm not going to argue the authenticity, the historical authenticity of this, but listen to what he said. Unlike the German population, he owes me nothing, okay? Now, Israel holds two assets concerning its foreign policy or international relations. One is that everybody is sure that in order to have good relations with America, you must pass via Jerusalem. And B is the legacy of the Holocaust.
Would you say guilt?
Guilt, whatever.
Okay.
The legacy of the Holocaust. That is to say, when you now start to have Muslim officials or Muslim immigrants becoming public figures in Europe and Muslim or constituencies in Europe, that the constituency has got more and more Muslim voters that can affect and influence the representatives, etc. What I want to say that nowadays when you have people who are decision makers in Europe and bit by bit there are more Muslims among them, so you have now a group of decision makers in Europe that owes us nothing, unlike the population around them. Okay? So this is something, just a sip.
Sure, but if you take this Palestinian German candidate,
yes.
he moved closer to the German zeitgeist, if you like, vis-a-vis Israel, than the community he came from. I mean, so his journey was not, he didn't bring his baggage regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the mainstream, but rather left it behind him to join the mainstream.
You have just said something very prudent and very wise. Excuse me for complimenting you, giving
very. I'll be the modest one here.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because we realize already that when you check, for instance, Muslim and Arab communities in the Arab and Muslim world, and you ask them about Israel, about Jews, etc., they have their views are probably expected views, and they are far from being positive. On the contrary, they are extremely negative. Now, when you check these communities in Europe nowadays, after spending some time in Europe, after exposing themselves probably to Jewish and European Jewish communities, you find less hostile and less negative views vis-a-vis Jews. This is something surprising because immediately you have Charlie Hebdo and you have the kosher supermarket and you have the Toulouse.
But these are aberrations, aren't they?
Absolutely. So what I want to say is that probably living together in Europe, you can find what you've just found and you correctly specified or mentioned concerning this Palestinian representative.
One maybe more historical question here is when you compare the Muslim presence, the Muslim immigration to the Jewish presence in Europe, one striking difference is, of course, the time. Because Jews have been in Europe for millennia, and Muslims have been there for not
probably
even a
generation
century.
or two, not more than this.
Does this depth play any role at all? Historical depth play any role at all? I'll tell you why I'm asking. Because there's pretty common use in relation to describing Europe as a Judeo-Christian continent. My question to you, having dealt with those issues of this triangle, do you think that it's fair really to lump Jews and Christians together in describing the heritage of the European civilization?
First of all, when you ask something about, you're absolutely right that we have Muslim immigration in Europe nowadays for less than half a century. The majority are probably less than even one generation. Okay, during the last probably 20, 25 years, you have the majority of these people, of this community nowadays that tries to live in Europe, or attempts to live in Europe. B, unlike Muslims, European Jews are citizens. They have voting rights. They were born there as Europeans already. And this is something yet to be given or to be taken or to be whatever proven concerning the Muslim communities or the Muslims in Europe.
They're not yet indigenous.
They are not yet people that vote in. The majority, by the way, of them do not yet vote in European elections. Okay. So A, there is a difference. B, you find something quite, I would say, strange, if not weird, if you take radical Muslims in Europe. Radical Muslims will tell you, listen, we came to Islamize the continent. So some people would say, listen, what kind of a joke is this? Or what kind of a behavior is this? Or something like this. In a moment, I'll come back to it. But I've already heard something else from radical Muslims, from minority of them, even the minority within the minority, that we came to do reconquista to the reconquista. Okay, the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, people I believe are familiar with it, that once belonged to the Muslims.
In
and
the 15th century, the Christians took
over and took it from the Muslims. And you hear some radical Muslims, they say, listen, we came to do Reconquista to the Reconquista. You do not find these things among Jews in Europe, for sure. Okay. This is another difference. And yet you have more and more, you see that, for instance, if you take issues like boys' circumcision, and if you take issues like halal slaughtering or kosher slaughtering, and perhaps some other aspects as well, or other issues as well, you could see that there are parallel subjects or parallel topics that interest both Jews and Muslims. And perhaps here there is a room to tell you something. I was in Poland. And in Poland, there was a prohibition on non-stunning slaughtering. That is to say, you must stun the animal before you slaughter it, or you must give it an electrical shock, etc.
Which is what halal and kosher slaughtering don't do.
Absolutely don't do. And I ask people from the Muslim community, what are you doing with this? This is a prohibition that, as a matter of fact, would not let you have halal meat. And they say, we do nothing. We let the Jewish community fight this prohibition. And believe me.
So at the end of the day, there's more in common between these two communities. And the only thing perhaps that separates them is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Perhaps,
or is this an oversimplification?
Allow me to be less optimistic, but probably I'll take the beginning of your words. Yes, there are issues that are common and are shared by both Jews and Muslims. Yes. On the other hand, you have the Arab-Israeli conflict, and you have the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in particular that affects the situation or the relations with the two communities. And probably unfortunately, you find among Muslim communities in Europe, you find more and more reflections or expressions of anti-Semitism. Probably things that we did not experience before within Arab and Muslim countries.
Would you say, having studied this issue and the trends within it, which trend do you think is on the rise and is likely to prevail in the future? That was expressed by the radical fringes that you just said of, undoing the Reconquista, or the other one that is integrating at the end of the day. And those people are, by and large, coming to Europe to live normal life, coming to work and ensure a future for their children. Which do you think really is on the rise?
I will be even more specific and say that perhaps 98%, if not 99% of Muslim immigrants to Europe simply came to better their life, to have more opportunities for themselves and their children, etc., etc. No doubt about it. And the majority, as a matter of fact, do their utmost to integrate in the continent. The question is whether the continent is prepared, bear in mind its history concerning minorities, to absorb them.
And do you think they're starting to address this question, the Europeans?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it, because when you see from time to time there are anti-immigrants eruptions in Europe, some of them could be vicious and hostile. Just bear in mind what happened a few years ago in Norway with this Andreas Breivik in Norway, etc., etc. Breivik killed 77 Norwegians. There were no Muslims. They supported the rights of Muslim immigrants.
Yeah, and he was a white supremacist.
Absolutely. Imagine how small is the amount of tolerance that this Breivik had or has towards the real issue, i.e. the immigrants themselves.
Right. Okay, Professor Amikam Nachmani, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about the love triangle, as it were, between Europe, Muslim immigrants, and the shadow of the Jews. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for being here. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Hapern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.